Economically, we're going to win with the economy. We're going to win with military. We're going to win with health care and for our veterans. We're going to win with every single facet. We're going to win so much, you may even get tired of winning. And you'll say, please, please, it's too much winning. We can't take it anymore. Mr. President, it's too much. And I'll say, no, it isn't. We have to keep winning. We have to win more. We're going to win more.
That's Donald Trump in April of 2016, promising Republicans they would get tired of all the winning. Joining us now is New York Times bestselling author and ABC News chief Washington correspondent Jonathan Karl, who uses that quote for the title of his new book, Tired of Winning, Donald Trump and the End of the Grand Old Party. John, it is so great to have you. We like stealing you for a day or two.
Oh, and it's great to be right here.
You're at the table. You're at the table. Congrats on the book. Everybody is talking about this. Let's go back to that quote in April of 2016, which is sort of launches us into this book, and what that winning has looked like in the 7 years or so since.
Yeah, I mean, tired of winning. Donald Trump has certainly won. He won the presidency. He's won almost total control over the Republican Party, but he has left wreckage in his wake. I mean, obviously, there are the election losses for Republicans, midterms, special elections, runoffs. I mean, it's been almost every time voters have gone to the polls since 2016, Republicans have either lost or not met expectations. But more to the point is the wreckage that he has left in his wake as he has gone about his winning. The people that have opposed him have seen their careers destroyed, especially Republicans. The people close to him, some have wound up in prison, disgraced, left politics entirely, broke with lawyers' fees. It's everybody who he comes in contact with seems to be the worse for it. But throughout the process, he has managed, and probably, and you have to give him credit to a degree, it's amazing that after all of that, he's where he is now, which is like the presumptive Republican nominee for president.
So how do you explain, John, this is a central question we've been discussing for years now, the loyalty that he has engendered, despite what you just said, despite what happens to anyone who comes in contact with him, whether it's somebody who heeded his calls to storm the Capitol and is now sitting in a jail somewhere, or whether it's Rudy Giuliani, who hitched himself to him and is now bankrupt and facing the potential for prison. And still yet, we were talking about this morning, yesterday, this Vermin comment over the weekend. You cannot get a Republican on the record anyway to criticize Donald Trump. How do you explain it?
Well, they've made a calculation, and I talk in the book about really two, I think, very critical moments in all of this where the Republican Party faced a choice, and they took the path of Trump. The first, most famously, of course, was when Kevin McCarthy went to Mar-a-Lago 8 days after Trump left in disgrace. We all know about that. The other one is when Ronna McDaniel faced a threat from Donald Trump on January 20th of 2021. I mean, the day he leaves office, I'm leaving the party. I'm going to start my own party. And McDaniel first, begs him not to go. You're going to hurt the people who helped you the most. You won't win. We won't win. We'll all lose. And it doesn't matter. You deserve to lose because you didn't fight hard enough for me. If you had, I'd still be president. And then they threaten him. They threaten, he's going to have legal fees. He's going to lose his ability to raise money. And he backs down. So what would happen if Kevin McCarthy had said, you know what? He's done. We're going in an entirely different direction. And what if Ronna McDaniel had said, go ahead, start your own party? I mean, he was at an absolute low point. But they felt that if he went, he would take his voters with him. And even if it was not the majority of the Republican Party, which at that point maybe it wasn't, that they would not win. They really focused on the next election, which was the midterms. And look, Kevin McCarthy wanted to become Speaker, and he became Speaker. Ronna McDaniel wanted to remain the RNC chair, and she remained the RNC chair. Now, to what end? I mean, last I checked, McCarthy is not still the Speaker of the House.
So now we are about a year from the next election. Donald Trump stands a real chance at winning. And there's been some reporting recently about what a second Trump term would look like. And you've got that in your book as well. Very, very timely. So give us a sense as to what they plan to do and how they almost telegraphed it by the site of their first campaign rally this time around in Waco, Texas.
Yeah, I mean, look, he had his first rally in Waco, which, and almost exactly on the 30th anniversary of the siege of the Branch Davidian compound, the cult that had a showdown with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, federal marshals, the FBI, that ended in that inferno that killed more than 50 people. I mean, one of the real kind of tragedies in recent American history. But it became a rallying cry for the militia movement. I actually wrote a book about these right-wing militias after one of the militia members, Timothy McVeigh, bombed Oklahoma City, the deadliest domestic terrorist attack in America at the time, killing 168 people in Oklahoma City. And he goes to Waco, Texas to hold the first rally. And I called Bannon, Steve Bannon, who is far more, I think people are starting to figure out that Bannon, once again, is an incredibly influential force on Trump right now. I mean, I think maybe the kind of the intellectual heart where Trump is, such as there is an intellectual heart, it's Bannon. And he says, what do you mean? We're the Trump Davidians. It's like embracing this idea of we will do anything to stand up against federal power, that the federal government is really coming out to get us, the deep state, which, by the way, they often mean Republicans when they talk about that. And I think that set the tone for what this campaign will be, which is a campaign of retribution.
John, there's so much in this book that it would require us to read it chapter by chapter on air to really get to everything that you have through your reporting and writing. My question to you is, there's an anecdote in the book that I'd like you to explain, and it has to do with Trump's lawyers coming to see Jack Smith at Justice, okay? So after explaining that anecdote to the audience, based upon your reporting and your relationship with people around Trump as well as Trump himself, do you think finally, at the end of the day, he is frightened?
I think the short answer to that is yes, but let me first get to the anecdote. So this is, as Jack Smith has already indicted Trump for the documents. There are lots of speculation that an indictment on January 6th is coming. So the Trump team asks for a meeting with Jack Smith. They go down, and there's a lot of secrecy surrounding the meeting. They come in early in the morning, come down to Washington. It's John Lauro, it's Todd Blanche, and they meet with Jack Smith and two of his two of his prosecutors. The meeting is incredible. I mean, I had some insight into like blow by blow of what happened in this meeting. Jack Smith comes in. They meet in the conference room. He offers them water, invites them to sit down, and then he doesn't say anything. And for the next 60 minutes, John Lauro gives this presentation as to why Donald Trump should not be prosecuted on charges related to January 6th. He goes into the First Amendment argument. He says Trump truly believed that he had won the election and was trying in good faith to do something about it. He goes through all the arguments that they would later make, actually in court briefings. Mm-hmm. Jack Smith takes notes and then doesn't ask a single question and then bids them farewell after the hour. What's interesting about the anecdote, by the way, is a few hours later, Jack Smith does slam down an indictment, but it's a superseding indictment on the documents that gets into the De Oliveira and the stuff in the tunnels and all the obstruction, the videotapes in Mar-a-Lago. So, but it gives no hint that that's coming. And the January 6th indictment comes a little over a week later, and it anticipates all of the arguments that they have just given him. I mean, it was a really interesting insight into how they operate,
Jonathan, a lot of reporting has borne out in the past week or so about what Trump would do in another term and how dangerous his presidency could be, specifically to certain people and groups. But you have an anecdote, a story in your book that also reflects on what a second Trump presidency would portend. Tell us about Johnny McEntee.
Yeah, I mean, I think Johnny McEntee is a central player to understand 2020 and what happened with Donald Trump, and an even more central player in deciding what's going to come next. McEntee, as you know, was the body guy. He was the guy that carried his bags. He was one of the very first employees of the Trump campaign in 2016, starting in 2015. He had worked as a junior person on the news desk at Fox News, quit that job to go volunteer for Trump, and he ends up being the guy that carries his bags everywhere. He keeps that job in the White House, eventually gets fired for issues araging out of his FBI background check, fired by John Kelly, but he comes back in 2020, and he's given the job of the head of the Presidential Personnel Office. I mean, maybe the most important HR department in the government, responsible for the hiring and firing of 4,000 plus federal political appointees. And he goes about rooting out disloyalists first of all, he hires a bunch of his friends to be in that office, and these are all kids in their, some of them in the early 20s. McEntee himself was 29 at the time, and they go about interrogating cabinet secretaries, deputy cabinet secretaries, senior officials throughout the federal government, trying to test for who is truly loyal, totally loyal to Donald Trump. So McEntee, after Trump lost in 2020, becomes incredibly powerful as he orchestrates the decapitation of the political leadership at the Pentagon. Esper is fired. 3 other top civilian leaders in the Pentagon are fired. And McEntee, I describe a scene, part of which had been out there, but the details of which are all new, about how he orchestrated this executive order, quote, executive order, that called for the complete withdrawal of troops immediately from Afghanistan by January 15th, the withdrawal of troops from Germany, the withdrawal of troops from the Middle East, and then they added Africa. And he arranged to have it done completely outside the National Security Council. And when this order hit the Pentagon, nobody knows what to do with it, because it requires this massive movement of troops and a lame duck president who's only obsessed with trying to overturn an election. Anyway, this was all McEntee. And I describe a scene that the Pentagon leadership comes to the White House. Robert O'Brien, the national security advisor, didn't know about it. The White House counsel didn't know about it. McEntee had done it all himself. The point of this is that McEntee or somebody like him will be there not at the end of a Trump presidency, but at the beginning of a Trump presidency, ensuring complete and total loyalty to Donald Trump at the very beginning. No more Mattises, no more John Kellys, no more Pat Cipollones, no more people that would stand up to Trump.
And that's why that anecdote is so critical to understand, because, and by the way, that national security advisor next time won't be Robert O'Brien. It'll be Mike Flynn or
Kash Patel.
Or Kash Patel.
Maybe Rick Grenell. We can come up with a good list.
Actually, all those names are viable, and they would sign right off on it. So that's a preview of what may be coming next.
They would say, yes, boss.
Yeah, that's right. And so let's talk, you get into the book, too, about some of these few, but some profiles in courage in the Republican Party. Liz Cheney, of course, leaps to mind first. She sacrificed her political career to stand up and say, no, actually, the 2020 election did go to Joe Biden, and everything we're doing to try to overturn it is un-American, violates the Constitution, everything else, loses her job. Adam Kinzinger, same, leaves Congress. So who's left in the grand old party, as you put it? Who are those profiles in courage? Or is it gone, as we've always known it?
I mean, first, there were some surprising profiles in courage that we saw at the end with Trump. And I think it's worth noting that if you looked at the January 6th hearings, for instance, almost all of the witnesses were Republicans, and they testified truthfully and honestly about what Trump did, about what really happened in the election. There was the entire leadership of the Justice Department, names that are not household names, that all threatened to resign on January 2nd of 2021 when Trump was talking about, appointing a new attorney general who would carry out his orders. Bill Barr stood up for him. I mean, Mike Pence had that, incredibly important moment, maybe the only moment he ever stood up to Trump in the White House, but might have saved the Republic. I mean, you don't know what would have happened if he had tried to do what Trump said. But yeah, they're largely gone. I conclude in the book, it's almost like a tribute to those that stood up. Romney, this is something that is an interesting little piece of Trump trivia. There is, in the National Archives, in a box, one of the 15 boxes that were sent back, there is a napkin that is now an official White House record in the archives. I guess it will be released in how many years they unseal this stuff. But it's a napkin that says, in Trump's Sharpie, Mitt Romney is a total loser.
Just musings on an Air Force
Just musing on an Air Force One napkin. And, he's right. And Romney was a loser. He lost in 2012. But unlike Donald Trump, he graciously acknowledged that loss and moved on and became a profile in courage in the Senate. He voting twice to convict Trump in impeachment trials. standing up to the, to his party. But Mitt Romney is a total loser, is maybe the most fitting piece of White House records of the Trump presidency.
And briefly, lastly, so many Republicans have bowed down to him. Few have stood up to him, including those vying against him to be their nominee. Up until very recently, most Republicans outside of Chris Christie weren't doing anything at all. So how do you assess Trump's chances now, not to get the nomination, of course, but he emerges next year as largely undented heading into this?
By the way, it's interesting. I recently looked back at this, and you may remember this more clearly than I do, but the polls a year ago were really stark. I mean, DeSantis was beating Trump soundly. Yep. There was a Wall Street Journal poll in the middle of December of last year with DeSantis well over 50%, Trump in the 30s. I mean, there was a real sense that he was not going to make this. But DeSantis and others made the calculation again that if they were going to beat him, they were also going to need his supporters. And it was an utter failure. I mean, DeSantis is now, maybe third. Yeah, I mean, so I don't think it's over. I think that Trump can still lose the Republican nomination. I think that one of the issues here is that people have not been focused on what he is doing right now, what he is thinking about, what he is preparing to do in a second Trump presidency. There's been endless coverage of the criminal cases, for sure, but there hasn't been much coverage of what Trump has actually been doing and saying, both in public and in private, and that's why I wrote this book.
We're seeing those alarm bells go off now, thanks in part to your book. It is titled Tired of Winning, Donald Trump and the End of the Grand Old Party. It is out today. ABC News chief Washington correspondent, New York Times bestselling author, Jonathan Karl. John, great to have you here.
Great. Thank you. Great to be here.
Congrats.